There is a reality every believer must come to terms with if they desire to walk in consistent victory and spiritual maturity. Life is not neutral. Destiny is not accidental. There is an active resistance against every man and woman who chooses alignment with God. This resistance does not come from one direction alone. It comes through a threefold opposition that has shaped human history from the beginning. The devil, the flesh, and the world are not random challenges, but organized forces that contend for the soul, the mind, and the future of man. Until this truth is understood, many believers will continue to fight battles blindly, misidentifying the source of their struggles and applying the wrong solutions. The devil represents the external spiritual adversary whose primary objective is to oppose God's purposes in the life of man. He rarely attacks destiny head-on. Instead, he works subtly, manipulating thoughts, planting doubts, and twisting truth. His goal is not always to make people sin openly, but to weaken conviction gradually. He understands that once belief is corrupted, behavior will eventually follow. Many believers underestimate this opposition, assuming that sincerity alone is enough. But spiritual warfare does not respond to good intentions. It responds to truth, authority, and awareness. The flesh, however, introduces a more complex dimension to this battle. While the devil attacks from without, the flesh operates from within. It is the fallen nature that resists spiritual order and discipline. The flesh is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it expresses itself as procrastination, compromise, or excessive self-focus. It craves comfort, recognition, and control. The flesh is the reason a person can know what is right, yet struggle to do it. Until the flesh is disciplined, spiritual growth will always be inconsistent. A believer may pray passionately, yet live carelessly because the flesh has not been brought under submission. Then there is the world, a system that reinforces both the devil's deception and the flesh's desires. The world is not merely people or physical environments. It is a mindset, a culture, a value system that normalizes disobedience and celebrates independence from God. The world trains people to measure success by material gain, social approval, and external achievement. It subtly pressures believers to dilute their convictions so they can fit in. Many lose spiritual sensitivity not because they rejected God, but because they absorb the values of a system that opposes Him. These three forces are not isolated, they work together. The devil introduces deception, the flesh finds it appealing, and the world provides justification. This is why the battle feels overwhelming when it is not understood. You cannot fight an internal problem with only external resistance, and you cannot overcome spiritual deception with emotional effort. Victory begins with discernment. When a believer understands the nature of this threefold opposition, prayer becomes more intentional, discipline becomes more meaningful, and obedience becomes more urgent. You were not called to be ignorant of the battle, you were called to be victorious in it. Awareness is not fear, it is preparation. When you understand what you are up against, you stop blaming circumstances and start taking responsibility for alignment. This understanding marks the transition from spiritual infancy to maturity, from reaction to authority, from confusion to clarity. The devil does not operate randomly, and he does not rely primarily on force. His greatest strength has always been strategy, and at the center of that strategy is deception. He understands that if he can influence what you believe, he can eventually influence how you live. Rarely does he begin with obvious sin. He begins with subtle distortions of truth, half ideas that sound reasonable but slowly weaken conviction. This is why the greatest battles are often fought in the mind long before they manifest in actions. One of his most consistent tactics is deception through lies and suggestions. He speaks in ways that sound like your own thoughts, creating confusion between divine conviction and demonic accusation. He questions identity, purpose, and timing. He whispers doubts about God's faithfulness, your worthiness, and the effectiveness of obedience. These lies are not always aggressive. Sometimes they are gentle, patient, and persistent. When entertained long enough, they begin to feel normal. This is how strongholds are formed, not through one dramatic failure, but through repeated agreement with small untruths. Another powerful strategy he uses is accusation. Once a believer stumbles, the devil shifts from tempter to prosecutor. He reminds you of past mistakes, magnifies your failures, and attempts to define you by your lowest moments. His goal is not repentance but shame. Shame paralyzes spiritual progress because it convinces you that you are disqualified from restoration. Many believers stop praying, stop serving, and stop believing not because God rejected them, but because accusation silenced them. When identity is attacked, authority is weakened. Distraction is another weapon he deploys effectively. He understands that if he cannot destroy your faith, he can dilute it. He fills life with noise, busyness, and unnecessary engagements that slowly push spiritual priorities to the margins. Distraction does not always look sinful. It often looks productive. But when intimacy with God is replaced with constant activity, spiritual sensitivity fades. Over time, a distracted believer becomes vulnerable because discernment is lost. The devil does not need to make you bad. He only needs to make you unavailable. He also exploits timing. He pressures impatience and feeds discouragement during waiting seasons. He knows that delay can feel like denial if perspective is lost. In moments when prayers seem unanswered and progress feels slow, he introduces interpretations that paint God as distant or indifferent. This is where many abandon divine processes prematurely. They move ahead of instruction, driven by frustration rather than faith. Yet the devil's power is limited. He cannot force obedience. He relies on consent. His strategies only succeed when they are unchallenged. Truth is the greatest defense. When lies are exposed, deception loses its grip. When accusation is confronted with identity, shame breaks. When distraction is replaced with focus, clarity returns. Resistance is not emotional effort, it is alignment with truth. Understanding how the devil operates does not produce fear, it produces confidence. You stop reacting blindly and start responding intentionally. You learn to guard your mind, test your thoughts, and remain anchored in truth. Awareness transforms vulnerability into vigilance. When his strategies are recognized, his influence diminishes. This is how believers move from being targets to becoming victors, standing firm not by strength, but by discernment and truth. One of the most misunderstood enemies of spiritual progress is the flesh, because it does not appear as an external threat but as an internal voice. It lives within the human experience, shaping desires, reactions, and choices. The flesh is not merely about immoral behavior. It is the self-centered nature that resists divine authority and prefers independence over submission. Many believers attempt to fight spiritual battles while ignoring this inner resistance, and as a result, they experience cycles of passion followed by inconsistency. The flesh is deeply opposed to spiritual growth because growth demands discipline, delay, and surrender. The flesh seeks comfort, convenience, and immediate gratification. It does not ask whether something is right. It asks whether it feels good, whether it is easy, whether it serves personal interest. This is why a person can genuinely love God yet struggle to obey Him fully. The conflict is not always between good and evil, but between calling and comfort. Until the flesh is brought under control, obedience will always feel optional. The danger of the flesh is that it often disguises itself as logic and self-preservation. It negotiates with truth. It suggests that obedience can be postponed, that discipline can be relaxed, that compromise is harmless if it is temporary. The flesh rarely demands open rebellion. It thrives on small concessions. A prayer skipped here, a boundary relaxed there, a conviction silenced for the sake of peace. Over time, these small compromises accumulate and weaken spiritual strength. The flesh is patient, and that patience makes it dangerous. Another expression of the flesh is pride, the desire to remain in control. The flesh resists accountability, correction, and authority. It prefers independence over instruction. This is why spiritual growth accelerates in environments of humility and slows down in isolation. When the flesh is dominant, a believer becomes defensive when corrected and selective when obeying. The flesh wants the benefits of spirituality without the cost of surrender. It wants power without process, visibility without depth. The flesh also resists consistency. It may allow moments of passion, but it resists daily discipline. It enjoys emotional highs, but avoids structured devotion. This is why many believers experience powerful encounters yet struggle to sustain transformation. The flesh tolerates inspiration but rejects training. It enjoys prayer when it is convenient but complains when prayer requires sacrifice. Until discipline replaces emotion, growth will remain unstable. Subduing the flesh is not about self-hatred, it is about alignment. The flesh does not need to be destroyed, it needs to be governed. Spiritual authority increases as self-control is developed. When the flesh is disciplined, clarity emerges. Decisions become easier, temptations lose intensity, and obedience becomes natural rather than forced. Discipline trains desire. What once felt difficult begins to feel normal. Victory over the flesh is a daily practice, not a one-time event. It requires intentional choices, consistent habits, and a willingness to say no to self for the sake of purpose. As the flesh decreases, spiritual sensitivity increases. This is how believers move from struggling with obedience to delighting in it, from being driven by impulse to being guided by purpose. When the flesh is submitted, destiny is no longer resisted from within, and spiritual growth becomes steady and sustainable. The world operates as a powerful system that quietly shapes thinking, values, and priorities, often without drawing attention to itself. It is not limited to people, places, or material things. It is a mindset designed to function independently of God. This system trains individuals to live by what is seen, applauded, and rewarded, rather than by what is true and eternal. Many believers struggle not because they lack faith, but because they have unconsciously adopted the standards of a world that measures success differently from God. The influence of the world is subtle because it often appears normal. It defines what is acceptable, fashionable, and desirable. It establishes benchmarks for achievement and happiness, encouraging comparison and competition. Over time, these standards can quietly replace spiritual priorities. Prayer becomes optional, integrity becomes flexible, and conviction is softened to avoid discomfort. The world rarely demands that you abandon God. It simply pressures you to adjust your values so faith becomes secondary rather than central. One of the greatest tools of the world system is normalization. When compromise is repeatedly presented as harmless or necessary, resistance weakens. What once troubled the conscience becomes familiar, and familiarity reduces sensitivity. The world trains people to laugh at what should be grieved and celebrate what should be questioned. This gradual desensitization makes it difficult to discern spiritual danger because everything appears acceptable. When discernment fades, alignment is lost. The world also amplifies the desire for approval. It teaches people to value applause over obedience and visibility over substance. Many are driven not by purpose but by perception. Decisions are made to preserve image rather than integrity. This pressure to be accepted can cause believers to hide convictions, avoid difficult truths, and remain silent when boldness is required. Over time, fear of rejection becomes stronger than commitment to truth. This is how faith becomes private and powerless. Another influence of the world is distraction through excess. It fills life with constant stimulation, information, and entertainment, leaving little room for stillness and reflection. Silence becomes uncomfortable because the mind has been trained to depend on noise. Yet spiritual clarity often emerges in quiet spaces. When a believer is constantly occupied, spiritual sensitivity diminishes. The world does not always pull people away through rebellion. It often does so through busyness. The world also reshapes identity by defining worth through achievement, wealth, and status. When identity is tied to performance, rest feels unproductive and waiting feels like failure. This creates anxiety and impatience, pushing people to move ahead of divine timing. Many abandon process because the world celebrates speed while God values depth. In such environments, obedience can feel slow and costly, even when it is producing lasting fruit. Overcoming the influence of the world does not require withdrawal from society, but transformation of perspective. It requires intentional resistance to ungodly values and deliberate alignment with eternal truth. When a believer learns to see through the lens of purpose rather than pressure, the world loses its power to define direction. Freedom is found not in escape, but in discernment. When the world no longer dictates values, the soul regains clarity, and destiny begins to unfold with confidence and peace. Many people misunderstand spiritual warfare because they assume that the presence of temptation means failure and that pressure automatically implies defeat. But there is a critical distinction that must be understood if victory is to be sustained. Temptation is an invitation, not a conclusion. Influence is real, but it does not have authority until it is accepted. What determines the outcome of any spiritual battle is not what confronts you, but what you consent to. This understanding alone delivers many believers from unnecessary guilt and fear. Temptation comes to everyone regardless of spiritual maturity. It is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of humanity. Even the most disciplined believers experience thoughts, desires, and opportunities that challenge alignment. The danger is not in the appearance of temptation, but in the agreement with it. The moment consent is given, influence becomes ownership. Until then, temptation remains external. This is why guarding the heart and mind is more important than suppressing emotions. What you entertain long enough will eventually seek expression. Influence often begins subtly, presenting itself as a suggestion rather than a demand. It appeals to logic, emotion, or convenience. It frames disobedience as necessary, harmless, or justified. Many believers fall not because they wanted to rebel, but because they reasoned themselves into compromise. When influence is mistaken for inevitability, resistance weakens. But when influence is recognized as optional, strength is restored. Awareness creates space for choice, and choice restores authority. Consent is rarely a sudden decision. It is usually the result of gradual tolerance. Small allowances lead to larger compromises. A thought that is not confronted becomes a mindset. A mindset that is not corrected becomes behavior. This progression explains why many falls feel sudden, even though they were preceded by unnoticed agreements. Victory is often lost privately before it is lost publicly. What is permitted in the mind eventually manifests in life. Understanding this distinction also changes how failure is addressed. When a believer stumbles, the goal is not condemnation, but restoration. Guilt focuses on the mistake. Conviction points toward change. Condemnation says you are defeated. Truth says you can realign. The enemy thrives when believers confuse temptation with identity and mistake a moment of weakness for a permanent state. But failure does not redefine identity unless it is accepted as final. Repentance breaks agreement with error and restores alignment with truth. Authority is strengthened when believers take responsibility for consent. You cannot always control what approaches you, but you can control what you allow to remain. Discipline begins with decision. When boundaries are clear, temptation loses intensity. When convictions are settled, influence loses appeal. Power is not the absence of pressure, it is the presence of clarity. This understanding brings freedom. You stop living in fear of every thought and start living in responsibility for every decision. You become alert without being anxious, disciplined without being rigid. Victory becomes sustainable because it is rooted in wisdom rather than effort. When believers learn the difference between temptation and consent, influence and surrender, they stop fighting shadows and start winning real battles. This is how authority is preserved and destiny remains intact. Spiritual victory is never accidental. It is the product of deliberate discipline consistently practiced over time. Many believers desire power, clarity, and authority, yet avoid the processes that produce them. Discipline is often misunderstood as restriction, but in truth it is alignment. It trains the soul to respond to truth rather than impulse and positions the believer to walk in sustained victory rather than momentary success. Without discipline, spiritual experiences remain emotional highlights instead of transformational realities. Spiritual discipline begins with structure. Prayer, study, fasting, and intentional silence are not religious routines. They are systems that cultivate sensitivity and strength. These practices create space for clarity in a world filled with noise and pressure. When discipline is absent, the believer becomes reactive, driven by circumstances rather than conviction. But when discipline is established, discernment sharpens. Decisions become proactive instead of defensive. Discipline does not eliminate temptation, but it strengthens resistance. Consistency is the power of discipline. Occasional intensity cannot replace daily alignment. Many people wait for emotional motivation to engage spiritual practices, but discipline functions independently of emotion. It is the decision to obey even when desire is absent. This is why disciplined believers remain stable during dry seasons. Their faith is anchored in commitment rather than feeling. When emotions fluctuate, discipline sustains direction. Spiritual discipline also trains the body and the mind to submit to purpose. The flesh resists discipline because discipline challenges comfort. It demands sacrifice, delay, and focus. But every time the flesh is denied for the sake of alignment, spiritual authority increases. Discipline teaches the soul that obedience is not optional. Over time, what once felt difficult becomes natural. Desire is reshaped by repetition. The believer begins to crave what once required effort. Another aspect of discipline is separation. Not every environment, conversation, or influence is neutral. Discipline teaches discernment in relationships, media, and habits. It is the wisdom to step away from what weakens spiritual sensitivity and to lean into what strengthens it. This is not legalism, it is stewardship. Destiny requires protection. Discipline guards the heart from contamination and the mind from confusion. Discipline also produces endurance. Many believers start strong but fade because endurance has not been developed. Endurance is the ability to remain consistent when results are delayed. Discipline trains patience, teaching the believer to trust process over immediacy. It breaks the addiction to instant gratification and replaces it with confidence in long-term fruit. This endurance is what separates those who start well from those who finish well. Victory sustained by discipline is quieter but stronger than victory driven by emotion. It does not rely on atmosphere or external validation. It is internal, rooted, and resilient. When discipline becomes a lifestyle, the believer is no longer easily shaken by pressure, delay, or opposition. Authority becomes stable because alignment is consistent. Spiritual discipline is not a burden, it is a gateway. It opens the door to clarity, strength, and freedom. Those who embrace it discover that obedience is not limiting but liberating. Through discipline, victory is no longer occasional, it becomes a way of life. True spiritual authority is not loud, aggressive, or performative. It flows quietly from identity, truth, and alignment with God's will. Many desire authority without understanding its source, assuming it comes from position, gifting, or experience. But authority is not something you claim. It is something you carry when your life is rightly aligned. When identity is settled, truth is embraced, and obedience is consistent, authority becomes a natural expression rather than a forced display. Identity is the foundation of authority. When a believer is unsure of who they are, resistance becomes difficult. Confusion weakens confidence, and insecurity opens doors to compromise. But when identity is anchored in truth, external pressure loses its power. You stop negotiating with voices that question your worth, your calling, or your legitimacy. Authority grows when a believer knows where they stand and refuses to define themselves by failure, comparison, or public opinion. Identity answers questions before they become battles. Truth sustains that identity. Authority cannot exist apart from truth because deception erodes confidence and clarity. Truth is not merely information. It is alignment with reality as defined by God. When truth governs thinking, decisions become cleaner and convictions stronger. Lies may still approach, but they are quickly recognized and rejected. This is why renewing the mind is essential to maintaining authority. A mind governed by truth cannot be easily manipulated by fear, accusation, or distraction. Alignment is the visible expression of identity and truth. It is obedience in action. Authority increases when words and actions agree. Inconsistency weakens spiritual credibility, while obedience strengthens it. Alignment is not perfection, but direction. It is the commitment to realign quickly when missteps occur. When a believer walks in alignment, resistance diminishes because spiritual authority is recognized in the unseen realm before it is manifested in the visible. Walking in authority also requires humility. Pride competes with authority because it seeks independence. Humility acknowledges dependence on God and welcomes correction. This posture keeps authority pure and sustainable. Those who walk humbly remain teachable, and teachability preserves growth. Authority rooted in humility does not need to prove itself. It simply functions. Authority is also expressed through peace. When identity is secure, truth is clear, and alignment is consistent, anxiety loses its grip. Decisions are made with confidence rather than fear. The believer becomes steady in seasons of pressure and patient in seasons of waiting. This stability is a sign of true authority. It reveals trust in God's governance rather than reliance on human control. Walking in authority does not mean absence of opposition. It means dominance in the presence of opposition. Resistance may still arise, but it no longer dictates direction. The believer stands firm, not because challenges are gone, but because clarity is present. Authority is exercised through obedience, sustained by discipline, and protected by truth. This is the life believers are called to live. Not one of constant struggle and reaction, but one of clarity and command. When identity is settled, truth is embraced, and alignment is maintained, authority becomes a lifestyle. The believer no longer begs for victory. They walk in it. This is not arrogance, it is inheritance.